Folks are still entering into the seminar on Zoom, but it's time, and I am going to get us started this afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. And this afternoon, we focus on a new book by Jeremi Suri entitled Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy, published by Public Affairs last October. Our discussants this afternoon are Chandra Manning of Georgetown University and Michael Fitzgerald of St. Olaf College. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the seminar. My colleague, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center, is traveling and can't be with us today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and well, since the pandemic and I guess post-pandemic era, here in the virtual realm. A few FYIs before we get going. Today's session is sponsored by the American Historical Association. Also, please take note, our next seminar will take place just several days from now, this coming Monday, and will focus on a just published book by Carolyn Eisenberg, Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia. Third, as always, we'd like to recognize two people whose behind-the-scenes efforts make these seminars possible. Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. And finally, on the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function and or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. All right, with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get the seminar fully underway. It's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's author, Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor in the university's Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He's the author of, or editor of, some 11 books on politics and foreign policy, including The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, Liberty's Surest Guardian, American Nation Building from the Founders to Obama, Henry Kissinger and the American Century, and Power and Protest, Global Revolution, and the Rise of Détente. His writings appear in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, The Atlantic, Newsweek, Time, Wired, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and others. Professor Suri is a popular public lecturer, and he comments frequently on radio and television news. And his writings and teachings have received numerous awards, including the President's Associates Teaching Excellence Award from the University of Texas. He hosts as well a weekly podcast, This is Democracy. Today, he is speaking on his latest book, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Jeremi, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar.
It's a delight to be here, Eric. I'm really excited to be here. And I want to thank you for hosting me again. I've had the privilege of being part of your seminar a few times. I want to thank our mutual friend, Christian Osterman, who I think is vacationing, a well-deserved vacation right now. And of course, I want to thank Rachel and Pete, who always organize things. Actually, most of all, I want to thank Chandra and Michael, whose work I know very well, but who I have not actually had a chance to meet personally. At least we've had a digital introduction now. I hope we'll have an in-person introduction at some point soon. So I'll take about 15 minutes just to get us started, and then the smarter people will say things, and we'll have I'm sure a really thoughtful conversation. As many of you know, and as Eric so kindly said in introducing me, I'm a historian, but I'm a political and diplomatic historian, and largely, not entirely, a historian of the 20th century, at least in my prior writings. That's really been a lot of where my home is. And writing this book was really a fun adventure in trying to dig deeper to understand many of the phenomena that I see as so significant to the 20th and 21st centuries as a political historian. And the idea of this book, the focus of this book, is is really to do what I think contemporary history is, which is to understand the history of our present. How did we come to our present moment? So although most of the book is situated in the 2 decades after the Civil War, periods that many, many historians before me have written about, including Chandra and Michael, the book really takes its point of departure from the last 5 to 6 years. And the question I've been asking at book talks around the country with every audience is, how many of you have been shaken by the last 5 to 6 years in our democracy? And I can report, I can't see your hands here, but I can report in about 25 cities, every audience and nearly every person in every audience has raised their hand and said they have been shaken by the last 5 to 6 years. The point of this book, the point of this research project, was not to write another book on Donald Trump or another book on January 6th, but to understand the deeper structural, political, historical origins for this moment that we are in. And my argument in the book, and this is the first of the 5 main points I'm going to make or introduce just to get us started today, is that we're not entering a new civil war, as some political scientists would argue. And there's a fair argument about certain conditions. Barbara Walters has written a wonderful book looking at conditions of civil wars in different societies. We're not entering a new civil war, but a point probably that's familiar to Chandra and Michael, the Civil War never really ended. In many ways, we're still fighting unfinished battles from the Civil War. I'm certainly not the first person to say that, but I do think it's something that's been missing from the political history of the 20th century. It's something that 19th century historians have perhaps been saying for a long time, but 20th century historians like myself have not been writing about at all. In fact, Cold War historians, and that's really where a lot of my work was situated until recently, have been kind of Cold War exceptionalists, have seen a kind of breaking point, a Nullstunde, in 1945 in American society and in global society. And of course, there are reasons to point to that. But fundamentally, my book argues that we are still fighting old battles over the meaning and structure of democracy, and that the contemporary turmoil and difficulties that we have confronted are exploitations. They are worsenings. They are aggravations of these pre-existing conditions. Or a way I've put it in many contexts when presenting this, there are cancers placed in our institutions after the Second American Revolution, which I think James McPherson appropriately calls the Civil War. After that period, there are cancers placed in our institutions, new cancers placed in our institutions as others are removed. And those tumors have been aggravated. They've metastasized, and they've been exploited by those who wish to metastasize them in recent years, but they're not new. And if you don't understand those sources as a political historian of the 20th and 21st century, and as someone who cares about contemporary politics, you don't know where to begin to solve the problems. And so it's a fundamental point about understanding historical structures and the long effects of historical structures, though not always seen in all moments over that long durée of history. And this brings us to the second point that I want to put on the table. That's a really central part of the book, which is that resistance to multiracial democracy is newly embedded in the institutions of American society after the Civil War. And this is something I spend a lot of time on, and something, quite frankly, I don't think has been written enough about, even by those like Chandra and Michael, who have done remarkable work on this period. I think there's much more to be written about the active resistance, not just the foot dragging, the internal resistance, but what I cover in chapter 3 of the book, which honestly was startling to me, though overwhelming in its evidence, the number of figures who actually don't just surrender on the surface and continue to resist, but actually refuse to surrender. The 50,000 Confederates who go to Mexico for existence, the many others who go to Brazil. And I profile in the book, and I'm certainly not the first to do this, but I think this is missed even in the standard historiography of the 19th century, the degree to which there is an active insurgency, not just within the United States, but outside of the United States, of Confederates who leave the country, working with Maximilian in Mexico and elsewhere, and mobilize a continued Confederate resistance, which is then renationalized thanks to the presidency of Andrew Johnson. And I'm often asked, how would things have been different? How do I think things would have been different if Lincoln had lived? I don't think Lincoln would have solved these problems. Of course not. But Lincoln would not have pardoned those who not only refused to actually accept surrender, but those who actually did not surrender, those military leaders, such as Joe Shelby, John Bankhead Magruder, Alexander Watkins Terrell, who actually is a Harris County judge, I talk about in the book, joins the Confederate Army, becomes a general, then moves to Mexico, refusing to surrender, joins Maximilian's spying service, spies on the U.S., on the Union Army, comes back, gets elected to the Senate in Texas, and then writes the voting laws in Texas. In fact, until 1944, the voting laws in Texas were the Terrell laws. Alexander Watkins Terrell created the white primary, which strangely, in the 2 years of Texas history in middle school that my kids were forced to have, never came up. The Alamo came up all the time. But the white primary, I just gave a talk a few days ago to a group of lawyers in Houston, and I asked them, these are lawyers educated in Texas, if they knew about the white primary. They don't know about the white primary. It was these former Confederates left the country, committed treason by any definition of the term, pardoned, return, then get elected to office and write the laws, the actual laws governing voting in a state like Texas. And most Texans don't even know the story today. What's the point here? The point is that resistance is not only at a low level below legitimate discourse, resistance is actually legitimized, actually becomes the mainstream of politics in many parts of the country. I think that's part of the story we have to talk about with law enforcement today. One of the other things I chronicle in the book, and again, not new to me in chronicling this, is the degree to which law enforcement is complicit and actually responsible for the Memphis riot in 1866, which is covered in detail by congressional investigation, the 1873 Colfax coup in our society. So the ways in which resistance to multiracial democracy is not simply an illegitimate resistance, but is actually legitimized in this post-Civil War politics, and then remains so. This is before Jim Crow. I think that's absolutely crucial in understanding the institutional failures, or some of the institutional near failures we've seen in recent years. And quite frankly, it's the only way I can understand the continued democratic institutional failures in the state of Texas today. Just to put this very plainly for you to understand how it looks in a wonderful city of Austin, in a state of Texas, which I guess is competing with Florida to be the most Confederate state these days. If you look out from Austin, you can see 30 million voters in Texas, 30 million potential voters in Texas. 1 million choose the governor. 1 million choose the governor. Those 1 million are the people who vote in the Republican primary. 1 million people choose our governor. So we have a governor of 30 million chosen by 1 million people. That's exactly how it was designed to work after the Civil War. That is not how it worked in Stephen F. Austin's or Sam Houston's Texas. That's exactly how it's designed. And this is not unique to Texas. Texas is always just an extreme version of the norm, not actually outside the norm in this sense. Okay, this brings us to the third point. I've talked about the continuation of the Civil War, how resistance is legitimized, resistance to multiracial democracy, just as also the push for multiracial democracy obviously grows. The third point I want to put on the table is that many of the standard remedies, many of the remedies we are taught are the appropriate remedies, repeatedly don't work. And this is the part of the book, this is the part of my looking back at this 2-decade period after the Civil War that was deeply influenced, self-consciously influenced by the world of the last decade. What we're told in Savers courses is that elections are supposed to resolve differences in our society, that we fight until the election and then the election resolves things. As I chronicle in the book, from 1868 forward, from the election of Grant in 1868, which is probably the fairest election for the next century, through 1872, 76, 1880, elections don't come anywhere close to resolving differences. The elections are close. They look just like today's, incredibly close, in some ways closer. Popular and electoral vote that are out of whack with one another. Candidates who once in office are called his fraudulency by the other side. All the language of fraud we see today, none of it is new. It's simply on a new platform. And our election system, in fact, doesn't work to resolve differences. It only works when we don't have close elections. It only works in this period that too many of us in the 20th century had treated as the norm. When you have elections, an Eisenhower election, a Nixon election, a Reagan election, for that matter, even a Barack Obama election, where the numbers are not actually close. But when the numbers are close, when our society is divided, our election system does not work in the way it's structured, because it leaves too much up to just a few votes in few places, which are easy to dispute. A coalitional system wouldn't necessarily require that. A PR system would. But if you take 1876 as the model for 2020 or 2016, right? A few votes in Louisiana a few votes in South Carolina, a few votes in, of course, Florida, actually turn everything, and how those few votes are counted. And of course, those votes are easy to dispute in two directions, right? That's the problem with our system. In addition to that, impeachment doesn't work. I spent a lot of time going back through reading the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and the ability to convict a president seems that's as close, of course, as we get. Even then, I'm not even sure we were that close. A president who clearly set out to violate the law as Congress had passed it, sets out not to implement the Civil Rights Act of 1866, sets out not to implement the 14th Amendment when those are clearly his constitutional duties. It is nearly impossible to actually remove a president who's doing such thing. In Johnson's case, I bring this up only in this audience because it's something that's still not widely known. It's pretty clear he actually uses the power of the presidency to bribe his way out of conviction, bribing Edmund Ross, recently appointed senator in Kansas, whose biggest supporter then becomes the revenue collector in New Orleans. Thereafter, it's very hard, if not impossible, under our system to remove a law-breaking president, as it is a law-breaking governor and various others. So the normal remedies don't work. This brings us to the fourth point, which is now where maybe I become more of a traditional political historian. I think a lot of this history shows how important leadership actually is. We underrate how much our system, for all the talk of checks and balances, for all the talk of constitutional procedure, how much our system in the end is very much dependent upon the character and choices of a few people in particular positions, not always presidents. We could be talking about Supreme Court justices. We could be talking about key governors. We could be talking about key military leaders. But in some ways, I want to make the case, especially to this audience, which has many historians, that actually some of the old political history has a lot to teach us about the importance of personality and character, not in the way it was talked about 30, 40 years ago of a very white male-focused kind of character, but that nonetheless the character, the integrity, the moral standing of the individual, and the ways in which the individual recognizes limits that can't always be enforced on his or her power. It's absolutely crucial. I think it's something we actually have to get back to teaching more of as historians and teaching more of in many settings. There's a big difference between a Lincoln and a Johnson. And in fact, many of the things that Johnson does are not things that Lincoln could have immediately corrected, but it would have been a very different set of situations. Lincoln would not have pardoned all the Confederates who returned and basically reinstill Confederate politics in so much of the country. Grant versus Hayes and Garfield and Arthur. Grant was limited in his political capabilities, also surrounded obviously by a fair amount of corruption, but Grant actually used the power of the presidency to try to enforce the law. I'll remind everyone here that we're still using the 1871 Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act to prosecute now, 967 individuals who committed insurrection on January 6th, 2021. They are being prosecuted by a law that Grant pushed through Congress, a law that he enforced to break the back of the Ku Klux Klan, but was then prevented from fully enforcing because his own party did not want to pay the costs of it. His own party had other priorities. And then because of the Panic of 1873, of course, Ulysses Grant created the Justice Department as part of this. Much of our world today is that structure, and that's very different from the presidency of Hayes, Garfield, Chester Arthur, presidents who did not prioritize, couldn't for all kinds of reasons, didn't have the standing, didn't have the legitimacy. I can't help but say that's a direct connection of that history to our own today. The character of the person in office matters. We as historians have to return to talking about that. Again, not in the old ways we always did, but we, I think, actually have to come back to that. For too long, we've been skeptical of that point. And then the final point, and then I'll shut up. The final point in the book that I just want to make for now, there is obviously much more, but the point I want to put on the table now is about the teaching of history. One of the reasons I wrote this book and wrote it in a way that I hope can be read by non-historians. I'm as interested in non-historians reading this as I am historians. Sometimes I try to write for policymakers. In this case, I really hope that I don't know whoever ordinary citizens are. I hope whoever they are, that this is a kind of book they would read, because I think it's really important that we understand that it is patriotic to tell the full history of our country. This is not a history designed to trash our democracy at all. It's a history, I think, to take advantage of the gift of the last 5 to 10 years, which is that the gift of the last 5 to 10 years has been the unmasking, even for a historian like me, after 20 years who is still somewhat naive about these things. It's an unmasking of some of the deep subterranean internal problems of our democracy, the cancers within our system that we didn't always see, and a chance to change them. The analogy I've been using, that I use in this book, is, to be a good parent, and this is how my wife has taught me to parent our kids, to be a good parent is not to tell your kids they're always right and always cheer for them. Be a good parent is to tell your kids you support them and love them, and then hold them accountable and help them to be better. And my kids will always then tell me how I can be better. They have a very long list. It's the same, I think, with the way we as citizens need to approach our country. I'm the child of immigrants. I love the United States. It's why I became a historian in many ways. If we love our country, we want to hold our country accountable to its values. We want to believe it can be better. We want to believe it can be better. And I think the story of this book is a story about choices after the Civil War, choices we are still living with, choices that are still in many ways undermining the full potential of what our society can be. So I want to close with a sentence of my own. I'm sorry to be quoting myself here. But, as writers, we put a lot of time into our words. So I want to make sure I get these last words right. If nothing else, I hope my book shows or inspires us to think about how democracies do not come together when they glorify their past. They don't come together when they glorify their past, but when they strive to repair it. When they strive to repair it. And this is a repairable past. It's a usable past for us. And I hope my book at least helps us to push forward a conversation that many of us are already having about using history to repair our democracy, not trying to close off minds and mindlessly cheerlead for a democracy that only gets worse if we do more of that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jeremi. Our first discussant this afternoon is Chandra Manning, a professor at Georgetown University, where she teaches U.S. history, chiefly the 19th century, including classes on the Civil War, slavery and emancipation, Lincoln, citizenship, the American Revolution, and the history of baseball. She began teaching at Georgetown in 2005, took leave to work at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and then returned to Georgetown full-time in the fall of 2017. Her first book, When This Cruel War Was Over, Soldiers, Slavery, and the Civil War, published by Knopf in 2007, won the Avery O. Craven Prize, awarded by the Organization of American Historians. It earned an honorable mention for the Lincoln Prize and the Virginia Literary Awards for nonfiction, and was a finalist for the Jefferson Davis Prize and the Frederick Douglass Prize. Her second book, Troubled Refuge, Struggling for Freedom in the Civil War, also published by Knopf in 2016, about Civil War refugee camps where former slaves allied with the Union Army and altered the course of the war and of emancipation. This won the Jefferson Davis Prize, awarded by the American Civil War Museum for the best book on the Civil War. A former National Park Service ranger, she has also advised historical sites, museums, and historical societies, as well as community groups in search of historical perspective. Chandra, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thank you to Jeremy. Thank you to Michael. Thanks for the chance to be here and to have this really important conversation, to read this interesting book. I will also say that I one day aspire to write a book that could win a prize not named for a dead Civil War president. So stay tuned. I hope that's going to happen someday. But to talk about this book today, on page 261 of Civil War by Other Means, Professor Suri notes that the country became more multiracial and more white supremacist at the same time. And my reading of the book, which happened before I heard his remarks, but I don't think I'm wrong about this, my reading of the book is that it stems in large part from the desire to explain those two opposite but true developments, and to do so by offering readers a long view of the final quarter, the late decades of the 19th century, always with an eye on our present moment, which is not a charge of presentism, but instead it's me saying that this book really seeks to explain how these two things, multiracialism and white supremacy, could be both opposite and true at the same time, not solely with reference to recent elections, but with the context provided by the late 19th century. Now, I will say that parallels between recent elections and the 1860s have been around us a lot lately. Who can forget the indelible image of the Army of Northern Virginia's battle flag in the halls of Congress on January 6th of 2021? My kids remember that clearly because I cried. And in fact, there are even more eerie parallels than are immediately obvious between recent elections. Did you know, for example, that in 1860, the state of Georgia tried to discount the votes of 5 states because Black people voted in those states, which made the election of 2020, in which the losing party wanted to discount Georgia's votes, in part because of how many Black people voted there, seem really pretty eerie to me. Professor Suri asks us to trace parallels like these through later decades of the 19th century, and then importantly, to connect those decades to our own decade. Now, there are definitely some scholarly stakes here. Civil War historians have been arguing a lot lately about when the Civil War really ended. Elizabeth Varon argues that it stopped at Appomattox and a contest about its meaning began immediately. Whereas a book called After Appomattox by Greg Downs argues that it ended in 1871 when Georgia's congressional delegation finally took its seats on Capitol Hill. But I think that debate is ultimately less important to Professor Suri than this larger aim of trying to understand our current moment, not as an unthinkable aberration, but as a development that has a history, a development with a history. And the book is at its best when it does that. It is at its best, I think, when it rescues those Confederados, those exiles who leave the United States rather than accept Confederate defeat. It's at its best when it rescues those forgettable Ohio presidents and their terms that no one can get in order. It rescues those from relative obscurity. It really takes us through the 1870s and 1880s. It tells us about the origins of the Department of Justice, about the post-presidency popularity of U.S. Grant. We all think nobody liked him until Chernow came along. But no, in fact, people did in the 1880s. It tells us about the powerful support for civil rights articulated by President James Garfield in his inaugural address in 1881. It's valuable for all these things. It's really valuable for its very clear insistence that leadership matters. It's not at its heart a book about the Civil War or the 1860s. And I think there are some ways for our conversation today in which a clearer view of some things about the 1860s can help us excavate the questions that Professor Suri raises even more effectively. Most of all, the one that jumps out to me is this old chestnut about state rights. On page 21, Professor Suri identifies a Southern vision of democracy around local control, home rule, and state rights. And I think it's really important to note that white Southerners in the 1860s and Confederates rarely spoke about state rights. They spoke about Southern rights, not state rights. And they emphatically did not mean local control. State rights before the war was opposition to control by voters, local or otherwise. It meant control by the state legislature, which in a state like South Carolina was a unicameral body apportioned by property ownership, not population, and voted everything up to and including presidential electors. So state rights means the legislators and not individuals are determining who a state's electoral vote went to. That's not local control. And there are more continuities between that and our current moment, I think, than we notice if we see the Confederacy about some glorified or some romantic social control or local control, excuse me. It's why the Confederate Constitution took away we the people and replaced it with we the states, not for local control, but to remove control from voters and to place it in the hands of leaders. It's also important to note that state rights rarely appears in Southern battles before the war. Southern rights do. And in fact, Northern state rights, for example, to resist the Fugitive Slave Act, were consistently listed as one reason why Southern states left the Union. I'm not trying to nitpick here. What I'm trying to say is that there is an inherently authoritarian vision that is at the heart of Confederate governance at the time of secession onward. And I think a clear view of that authoritarian vision aligned with the central state, the Confederacy, can help us trace these threads that Professor Suri draws for us even more clearly. Now, a central state, the Confederacy, aligned with that authoritarian vision, engaged in a pitched battle against the United States for 4 years, and there was no foreordained winner in those 4 years. Confederacy came close a couple of times. By the spring of 1865, it couldn't keep an army in the field, and it couldn't feed the men it did have. And so armies surrendered, and a central state known as the Confederacy ceased to exist. That the surrender of armies didn't mean the end of violence is absolutely true. In fact, the persistence of violence helps explain the form that Reconstruction took, as well as the Republican Party and the majority of Northern voters emerging convictions that not just a 13th, but also a 14th and 15th Amendment would be necessary. With the passage of those amendments, the United States entered into a genuinely unprecedented time of multiracial democracy that coexisted with widespread extra-legal racial violence in the South. Now, world events didn't end then either. The 1870s also saw transnational trends like rapid industrialization, disruptive economic cycles that culminated in the Panic of 1873, biggest depression in US history to date. So what did it look like to have all those things going on at once in a nation that just came through a war more draining than any of us can imagine? It looked like what Professor Suri rightly describes as the coexistence of multiracial democracy on one hand and white supremacy on the other. The elections of 1872 brought biracial state and national governments that passed and enforced the KKK Act, a national government that passed a Civil Rights Act. States in which every Confederate state except for Virginia elected a biracial Republican majority in 1872, and Southern states would go on to write their most progressive constitutions in their history, passing state civil rights bills in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida. Those are unprecedented times. Those are times that saw an unprecedented multiracial democracy, but they also saw violent resistance to that democracy, just as Professor Suri points out to us. In the 1870s, as economic woes and corruption started to distract Northern voters, white Southern elites figured out now was the time to take back power. And Professor Suri's book discusses how. Incidents of outright violence like the Clinton barbecue and the Hamburg massacre. Also, the murder of elected Black officers, like one named Buck Cable, who was dragged into the street on Christmas night of 1875 and shot 40 times. Also, political campaigns like Wade Hampton's governor's campaign of 1876, in which Hampton formed a rifle club called the Red Shirts. Their motto was, if we have to wait, Hampton will be governor if we have to wade knee deep in blood. And the state, I'm not kidding you on this, the state sold out of red cloth because red shirts were so popular. The 1876 was also the year resulting or culminating in the hotly contested election that Professor Suri covers in his book, and followed by final removal of troops from the South. Those troops were materially important, but also symbolically important as a recourse that formerly enslaved people had access to against the increasingly organized violence to reassert white supremacy. And the construction of a particular lost cause memory, not mistily romantic, but actually violent at its core, was well underway. You take the example of Julian Shakespeare Carr, a North Carolinian involved in the campaign to remove Black voting rights from the state constitution that a progressive North Carolina biracial legislature had passed. Also instrumental in placing the famous Silent Sam statue on the campus of the University of North Carolina. The speech at which that statue was dedicated, Carr spoke about the importance of the spot of that statue as the place where he, quote unquote, horsewhipped a Negro wench in the days following the Civil War. My point is, men like Carr and many like him illustrate again and again the resistance to multiracial democracy that Professor Suri writes about. That existed, no doubt. But I want to return to the opening line of the book, which says, worries about a new civil war in America are misplaced because the Civil War never fully ended. It's an effective first line. It's provocative. It points to the truth that the underlying issues remain unresolved, and that even if they look like they got resolved, they don't necessarily stay that way. But I want to ask, now I'm getting to a couple questions I'd like to pose. I want to ask what we might lose by lumping all violence together and calling it warfare. Are there important differences between nation states and other kinds of nation states fighting against each other and other kinds of violence? Human beings have been endlessly inventive at finding ways to perpetrate violence upon one another. So might we understand those ways even better if we attend to their variety rather than calling them all warfare? I'm also curious about women and gender and how incorporating those themes might deepen even further what Professor Suri has to tell us. To go back to that Wade Hampton campaign, Wade Hampton is running for governor, stages these elaborate affairs in which he'll ride into town, and in the middle of the town there's a stage, and there's a woman lying on her back covered by a black robe until he gets there. And Hampton gets there, flings off the black robe, pulls her to her feet, and there she is, dressed in a long flowing white gown and a tiara that says South Carolina. He never says a word, but there's definitely stuff about gender and white supremacy's role in protecting white womanhood going on. And I'm wondering if incorporating some of that could help us see even more important things. And then finally, my concluding question might be my most important. The coexistence of two opposites, multiracialism and white supremacy, is a truism of US history. But the relationship between those two things shifts. Certainly there is a hard tilt towards the white supremacy side in the antebellum South, which explains the onset of the Civil War, and a hard tilt toward the white supremacy side in the later decades of the 19th century. I'm curious about whether you think we should best understand those hard tilts as reversals of something that came before, or central continuities. What forces enable one side or the other to get the upper hand? The classic way of asking this is, did Reconstruction fail or did it get overthrown? But I think you're asking it in a slightly different way, which is, why does one side of this equation sometimes have the upper hand, and why sometimes the other? And I'd love to hear you talk more about that relationship in particular. So thank you.
Thank you, Chandra. Jeremi, there are some questions on the table. If you would like to respond to them, you can. But you are muted.
Yeah. I'm muted. I was trying to listen very intently, and I took 3 pages of notes there. Chandra, Professor Manning, I really thank you for those really insightful comments and for contextualizing the book as you did. So I'll start from the first question and make my way to the last one, which I think is the hardest and the most important, as you said. What do we lose by lumping all violence together? You're certainly right. Paramilitary violence is different from organized, traditional state Weberian warfare. I'd be the first to say that as a diplomatic and military historian. Insurrections are different from efforts at state law enforcement. There are all sorts of ways in which we can point to the variety of violence, as you say, and I by no means mean to lump it all together. But I do think there are a couple of similarities that do need to be emphasized that we lose when we appropriately separate these things out, right? And so the first is how violent American politics are. Traditionally, the teaching and discussion of American politics presumes there's violence and then there's politics, and politics is the remedy or the alternative to violence. Now, there are varieties of violence within the politics, but the point I'm making is that there's a lot of violence in the politics, right? And the example I've been using recently is actually what happened at Nancy Pelosi's house in San Francisco, right? The gentleman who broke into her house was interrogated by the FBI afterwards. There's an affidavit from him available online. And he said something to me that just jumped out of the violence of the 1870s. It was sort of Ben Tillman in the Bay Area a century later. He says, I wanted to break her knees and wheel her into Congress so the other Democrats would see the consequences of their actions, which is exactly Ben Tillman saying, I want to break the arms of the Republicans so they see what happens if they try to support African American enfranchisement, right? So the violence, the bullying in our politics, it's not all the same. There are different versions of that. When we as a country try to bully another country, that's clearly a different vector, or when a country tries to bully us, that's a different vector than internal bullying within our politics. But my point is simply this, that our politics are infused with violence. We don't see that because it's been normalized. And guns and all the stuff we could say about today, that seems so new. Everyone says it's not. It's not. And I want us to see how our politics infuse that. I think we need to grapple with that as a society, as we still pay attention, of course, to the differences, to the variety. We in the diplomatic political side of the historical profession have for too long talked about militarization as if it's something that's just institutionalized. I see what happened on January 6th or what happens in Colfax in 1873 as militarization as well. And we need to start talking about it that way. So we can see connections, I think, without lumping things together. It's the connections that I really want to emphasize. The point about women and gender, I think, is spot on. The book is largely the story of male political actors, and it is largely the story of men in various different settings. Those are the figures who I think were most important to the politics that I was chronicling, but they are not the most important people in understanding that society at its time. There are two different things. And I think when we're writing political history, we have to be attentive to all kinds of issues. But for me, what interests me, it doesn't have to interest everyone else the same way, but what interests me are the ways in which the individuals who have the most power use their power in the time. So if I were writing about individuals with power, political power today, it would be a different cast of characters than it is in that setting. But that's in no way to devalue or diminish the other characters that could be seen in different frameworks for this period. I think the strength of history, and I think we all agree, right, is that it's a religion with many churches. There are many ways for us to write about these things. And then now that, I mean, those were both great questions. Now the really big one, in this, what we might call, right, this Hegelian structure of multiracialism and white supremacy struggling with one another, in this dichotomous way, in this dialectical way. What is it? How do we understand reversals and continuities? I think that's exactly what I'm interested in. That's probably the central question of the book, right? As these two, as they say, dichotomous forces are contending in a dialectical way with one another. What is it at times that leads us to have more of one than the other? What gives, as you say, a tilt or the upper hand to one? What gives the spirit of history, in Hegel's terms, the ability to move one way or another? And my answer in the book is that it has quite a lot to do with the organization of violence, who has access to the means of violence, who has the will, and who has control of institutions. And it's a complex answer to your question, but those are the three things that I look to, right? So I argue in the Grant chapter, I think Grant and the Republicans don't have enough will. I think that's a Clausewitzian moment there, where the Republicans actually control the institutions. They have the money and they have the guns, but the Northern Republicans don't want to keep pushing. And there are all kinds of reasons why they don't. And Grant is not a good enough leader to actually convince them, to persuade them on this. I think when we get to impeachment, there it's an institutional problem. There it's an institutional. Our Constitution makes it nearly impossible to remove a corrupt, illegal president. And when it comes to what you described so eloquently and compellingly, Chandra, the experience in the South, even as the constitutions and the laws are changing to become more multiracial, the reality on the ground is that the former enslaved persons who are now free people don't have access to the resources to defend themselves. And I mean, this is Memphis again in 1866. This is Colfax. This is even with the legal structure on their side, they are materially deficient and unable to defend themselves. And so in a kind of brutalist way, the material supremacy of one side that's a carryover from the past allows that side to continue to dominate over the other. So those are the three things. And I think it's a complex, as any sort of Hegelian dialectic is, it's very complex, but it's institutions, it's will, and it's material, the sort of Marxist material factors, which are the guns and the money that people have. Thanks for those super questions. And I need to think about them more. So those are only preliminary answers.
Thank you. Before we continue, just a reminder, those of you who wish to pose questions can use the raise hand function in Zoom. That way I can call on you and you get to unmute yourself and pose the question directly. Otherwise, you can, as a number of people have already done, post questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. In those cases, I get to read those questions. Our next commentator this afternoon is Michael W. Fitzgerald, a professor of history at St. Olaf College. Professor Fitzgerald specializes in Southern history. He teaches African American history, the Civil War, and topical seminars on slavery, civil rights, and related topics. He's the author of several books, including The Union League and Social Change in the Deep South During Reconstruction, published in 1989 by Louisiana State University Press, Urban Emancipation, Popular Politics in Reconstruction Mobile, LSU Press 2002, and Reconstruction in Alabama, From the Civil War to Redemption in the Cotton South, LSU Press 2017. His current project focuses on a Ku Klux Klan connected family in Alabama during Reconstruction, and his various articles of his dealing with aspects of Reconstruction have appeared in the Journal of American History, Journal of Southern History, and Civil War History. Michael, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. People can hear me. All's well. All right. I thank you for the invitation. I'd like to say at the outset that I'm kind of addressing this as a Reconstruction historian, and the author's background is considerably broader and considerably more present in orientation. And so I want to talk about this from the point of view who's sort of specialized in the 19th century. The book's heavily based on politics, and particularly in the second half on presidential politics. Now, as a political historian, that's fine with me, but I want to talk about the limitations. The author's tendency is to frame things in presentist terms, to highlight the analogy to today's events, which makes sense in terms of the modern audience. But the political terrain of the mid-1800s is so different, and the emphasis on a Republican Party that was simultaneously pro-corporate enterprise and anti-slavery, that it's probably important to bear the differences in context in mind. The Republicans lost power because they were seen as a vehicle for corporate favoritism and corruption, and which left them ill-situated when the economy soured after 1873. The Democrats were less susceptible to corporate blandishments, but they were aggressively white supremacist. That's their selling point before the electorate. None of these political actors would fully suit our inclinations now, though of course the issue of racial justice, I think for most of us, is the more important of the two issues. Now, in terms of the pre-war discussion, the author is at pains to emphasize the Republicans are not that great on race. Before the war, he states, the Republican Party opposed the spread of slavery because it harmed white working men. Well, that position is certainly true of Lincoln. He stressed that aspect in speeches a good deal. But the Republicans and Lincoln himself also emphasized the core immorality of racial enslavement for Black people. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Lincoln said things like that often. Most Republicans didn't believe in racial equality before the war, but the belief that slavery was somehow immoral was widespread amongst them. And the war tied racial equality to the cause of the nation, to Union patriotism. Similarly, the author says that after the war, Republicans, quote, did not prioritize the interests of African Americans. Well, maybe they didn't prioritize the welfare of African Americans enough not to sustain Reconstruction permanently. But outrage at Southern oppression fueled the enactment of Black suffrage and the passage of 3 constitutional amendments to enforce civil rights. Not good enough is not the same thing as nothing, given that the civil rights issues convulsed national politics for years. The partisan divide was stronger on race than just about any other issue. If the second half of the book's focus is on presidential leadership, that choice leaves some issues to the side. Defining the issue that way de-emphasizes some of the things historians of Reconstruction have found important, at least since the revisionist wave of scholarship of the 1960s. A couple generations of social historians have focused on this aspect. The whole social process of emancipation, how it played itself out on the plantations, how it dovetailed with Black grassroots politics after freedmen received the right to vote, all that might have been addressed in a book conceptualized differently. Also, Black agency has been a central theme in the literature, what Black people wanted from their freedom, and how it dovetailed with Black family life and the emergence of Black churches, the spread of Black education. I mean, there is a lot going on that is coming from the Black community itself. In addition, we could talk about collective empowerment, what was happening within the Black community in class terms, with emancipation and enfranchisement. In other words, given that the novel feature of Reconstruction is direct Black political influence and a good deal of Black office holding, it would make sense to talk a bit more about what Black politicians did in power, what they could accomplish, and what the limitations and problems were. Of course, one can't do everything, and the book is of reasonable length, but historians of the field have spent a lot of time thinking about what Black people could do at this moment when they actually have substantial political influence. Now, even within the focus on white violence, which is central to this book, the issue of who the terrorists are exactly and what their goals and motives are could use a little more clarity, and perhaps the author can talk a bit about these aspects in his remarks. The author talks about the plantation elite a good deal, and they come off as the villains of the piece. But it certainly seems like most of the white population are in the South are behind slavery, white supremacy, and the Confederacy and its racist legacy. Given how the future of the South played out, it probably makes sense to acknowledge that outright. Right? It isn't just the leadership; it's the bulk of the white population. I was also interested in the framing of this work, the framing of the beginning of this work, on the similarities between the secession crisis and the events of January 6th, 2001. The author is certainly right. The secessionists and the Capitol occupiers shared white supremacist beliefs. The difference, though, is that secessionists seldom doubted that they had lost the presidential election to Abraham Lincoln, that his majority in the Electoral College was real. Secessionists could count votes. They just thought they had the legal right to leave the Union at pleasure. Their sense that Lincoln's election represented a threat to a way of life based on racial enslavement looks accurate. In some respects, they inhabit a world with considerable rational basis, which is quite different from the crowd that stormed the Capitol, believing that Biden's electoral majority did not exist. There is a real difference between what's going on in 2001 and 1860, and we probably need to talk about that, because what's happening now is stranger. All right. Pursuing the theme of present-day politics, of course, impeachment comes up given our lavish experience of it in the last few decades. I was thinking that the author seemed surprisingly sympathetic to the anti-impeachment position, whereas most historians are so hostile to Andrew Johnson that they're mostly sympathetic to the impeachment cause. It seems that the author is concerned about the weakening of the executive, and if memory serves, he was concerned about the weakening of the president's ability to conduct foreign policy. I was wondering if the author would care to comment on this, given that the impeachment of Donald Trump twice does not seem to have hobbled his successor's conduct of foreign policy, which seems pretty aggressive. At least it does not seem to have appeared to have undermined President Biden's position so far. The second half of the book examines the sad history of Republican presidents' retreat from Reconstruction, abandoning their Black allies in the South to their fate. I think this is giving too much credit or blame to U.S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and their successors. It seems clear that the Northern public had given up on Reconstruction, that national opinion had turned against federal enforcement of voting rights. One needs to talk about the broader retreat of public sentiment favoring federal protection for the freed people, rather than just individual leaders' actions. Part of this occurs as a result of the catastrophic depression which started in 1873, which undermined the whole big government agenda of the Republican Party, of vast subsidies for corporate enterprise and the protection of the freed people's rights. The author never spends much attention on this issue, but is critical why things turned out so badly. I was going to ask another question about the conclusion. Historians don't generally end this tale with the assassination of President Garfield in 1881. They normally extend the story to the populist revolt or beyond. For a generation after Reconstruction, Blacks continued to vote in substantial numbers, and they could occasionally influence elections in coalitions with different factions of dissident whites. The question is, what endpoint makes the most sense interpretively to help one address big issues of where America was headed? If one ends at, say, 1900, one can talk about disfranchisement, the emergence of Jim Crow segregation, and of course, lynching. I was wondering if the author would like to talk about why he chose to end the book where he did, because the choice is unusual. Actually ending with Garfield is one of the unique aspects of the book. That said, I look forward to hearing what the author would have to say about these and other relevant points, and particularly about the endpoint, which interests me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Jeremi, responses?
Yes, thank you, Michael. You've given me so much to think about. I really, as I said to Chandra as well, I really am appreciative of your close and careful reading and the expertise you bring, as you said, as an expert on Reconstruction, someone who has spent years and years and more time than I have. I spent some years working on this. You've spent much longer understanding and writing about this period, and I deeply value your comments. So thank you all the way down. I'll address some of them, the ones I think you emphasize the most. And if I miss one or two that you really want me to hit on, let me know. But I have like 18 points here, so I can't cover them. And they're all good points, so I can't cover them all. And I'm not prepared to cover them all, actually. But let me start with your point about Republican abolitionism or anti-slavery elements, the degree to which the Republican Party was filled with people, and sometimes even Lincoln, who saw slavery as morally wrong. And I agree with you 100%. That is something I've spent a lot of time and written about elsewhere, also when writing about Lincoln and in my book on presidents. My point, though, is actually a different one, that the Republican Party had framed itself for electoral reasons to be a party that was not an abolitionist party, even though it had people in it who were abolitionists. And what struck me, and you know this, these materials as well as I do, if not better, Lincoln's constant pressure in 1859 and 1860 to other Republicans not to make abolition, not to make that a central part of the way that they projected what the party was. And so that's my point, that the party made a conscious choice, and the leaders of the party made a conscious choice for the Republican Party to be a party against the expansion of slavery, but not a party for the elimination of slavery. I do think it's crucial, because then I think it becomes very difficult to go from that position, which is a position that does acknowledge some degree of Southern rights in that context, to then pushing harder on the civil rights issue. And that's the point that I was making. And as I read the language of a John Sherman or a Lyman Trumbull, these members of the Senate from the Republican Party who I spent time reading their papers and correspondence for writing this book, I found that they were using the same language. They were coming back to that language in their discussion of politics, in their discussion, particularly John Sherman when he's negotiating in 1876 as part of the compromise in that election. I mean, he's very much making an argument. I think C. Van Woodward, right, called it a sort of an appeal to the old Whiggish position, which was still a part of the Republican Party. So I think it's less about the individual preferences of the politicians. It's more how the party has situated itself, how it's identified itself, the norms of behavior and political competition that the party has undertaken. But I take your point about abolitionism. I take your point also about writing a story that is much more, writing a history that is much more driven and focused on African-American agency. I did spend time in the book because it interested me considerably in the role of African-American soldiers and the ways in which it's an extraordinary story. It's a story actually I love teaching the students. I was just doing this a couple of weeks ago. The transition, the incredible transition from being enslaved to becoming a Union soldier. And the transition that I think it's 125,000 African Americans undertake, and it's something Chandra's actually written about, of course. And so I do see their agency, obviously, but for the story I was trying to tell, which was trying to understand how the national politics shift, I still felt that for my story, these actors were the ones who mattered most. It doesn't mean they're the ones who matter most, of course, for the story of Reconstruction, but that's slightly different from the part of the story that I was trying to tell. But sure, I wish I had spent more time on that, and honestly, I wish I had done more research on that. There were limitations that I'll frankly admit on that, and more based on my priorities, not based on what the objective history would be as such. You raised the question about the insurgents. Who were the insurgents? Who were these terrorists? And I like the fact that you called them terrorists in this time. I think that's right. I think they were a broad swath of the population, but I do think what is significant about it is that there were empowered figures who had access, back to the point I was making earlier, right? Access to resources, access to guns, to money, to status, and the ways that was used. I was struck when reading the 3 volumes, I think it was, of congressional investigations on the Memphis riot of 1866, how central local law enforcement and judges and others were. People who had access to status, access to resources. It doesn't mean they were the only ones or even most of the people out, in this case, raping African American women, destroying their homes in Memphis, but it means they were some of the crucial actors. They were some of the ringleaders. And I do think a lot of insurgent behavior, whether it's the moment we're talking about here in the 1860s and 70s or today, is actually crucially triggered and led by people who are far from grassroots deprived individuals, but individuals who have access to privilege, access to resources. And this is an old Charles Tilley point, right? That sort of mobilization actually requires a certain degree of resource access that often poorer citizens don't have. And so I do think that's an important part of the story. And again, a part of the story that I wanted to tell. I love, and you've really provoked me, Michael, to think about 2001 versus 1860 in terms of rationality. And you do make a very strong point that the Confederates really did think that Lincoln had been elected president. You're right. And I'm guessing, I mean, it appears that there's still people who think that Biden was not elected president, though I wonder whether they really think that, or whether that's a rhetorical position they take. So that's another story. But I will grant that. But what I think is fundamentally similar, and I think deserves emphasis, it's obviously not the only point, but what I think deserves emphasis, that I try to put that emphasis on, is the belief in both cases that the right to insurrection, the right to choose to live your own way, the right to your own authoritarian sectional existence, basically trumps, quite literally in 2001, that it trumps the procedures and assumptions and established norms of democracy, the willingness to violate those norms. And I see rationality in the sense in both periods by individuals who believe that the old norms or the established norms of democracy are harming their interests. What I see in 1860 and what I see in 2001 is you have groups of individuals who see, in one case with the potential end of slavery, and in another case with a much more diverse society, with more foreign-born citizens than we've had since the late 19th century, a fear that they are losing power, and a right to insurrection, a right to secession, a right to use violence to hold on to power at all costs, in violation of those democratic norms. And in that sense, I see in Marjorie Taylor Greene all of this old story. I don't actually see her as worse. Of course, she's different. I see her as part of that same tradition. In a certain way. On impeachment, you're absolutely right. I have mixed feelings on it. The last thing I think we need is for trying to start a process, a conveyor belt of impeaching every president and then failing to convict them and just wasting time. I mean, we're going to go down that route probably. And you're right. It hasn't seemed to limit Biden's foreign policy power too much. But I do think we need a way, this is really my central point, we need a way to deal with presidents who are illegal actors, which is to say not doing their jobs, explicitly not enforcing the law when that is their job. And we need to have a way to deal with that. And we don't. Impeachment doesn't work. I don't want to do more of that, but we've got to find some way. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's a real failure of our system. And as someone who moves a lot in circles of people who study presidential power and things like that, this is not an argument that's talked about enough. Right. And it is something I think that we need to think about. Last point. I don't want to take too long. Your question about the end point. I struggled on that. I actually had a chapter that went further, a part of a chapter. It wasn't. Why did I end with Garfield's death and a little bit of Chester Arthur? Because I think that's really Garfield's the last of the Republican presidents who I think had a chance to do something different, who thought he could do something different. I mean, to me, the break there was with the end of Garfield. I mean, we're moving into the world of Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland. We're moving into a world where it's a Republican Party that has I think, accepted all of the things we've been talking about. I think Garfield was the last Republican president of that generation who actually saw himself connected still to what we might see as more the Lincoln Grant agenda. I don't see that afterwards. And I think that's important, but I think, as always, there are many different ways to define an endpoint. There was a part of me that wanted to go all the way to Theodore Roosevelt. But I think that would diminish the point about this Republican moment and the Republican Party of this moment and the political institutional structure of this moment. Thanks for your great questions, Michael, and I do want to think about them more.
Thank you. Before I open this up, I have to say I have a couple of questions of my own that I want to get out there. And the first question on my mind is framed by your final paragraph, in which you write, visualizing the persistence of violent white supremacy is necessary to eradicate it. The alternative possibilities offer us historical hope that we need for our own difficult days. We have a lot of work to do. There's a passion in this book that is driven by our contemporary political moment. And so in the very first pages and in the very end, you talk about the here and now. And the 250 or so pages in between gives us this history from the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. If I were to say, I can read this as a very depressing book, not because of the violence that takes place in the 250 pages in the center, though there is that, but because the lessons that seem to be embedded here don't seem to lead me to a very hopeful conclusion. People have visualized white supremacy many times. Former slaves envisioned white supremacy. They didn't need to envision it. They experienced it. It was quite obvious. The civil rights movement dealt with this on a regular basis. And this is not something that you deal with in this particular book. And then here we are, in 21st century America, where we seem to be under such political threat. But the book seems to imply, that failure with its roots in the Civil War period is something of, if not a constant, then it's certainly a recurring theme. And so what I try to think of the moment right now, anytime you turn on cable news of any sort, I don't see where we as a people go from here with the knowledge of this history. The country is divided, and pointing out to Marjorie Taylor Greene or the rest of her group the errors of their ways is not going to get you that far. So I'm just wondering, why do you see this as an optimistic story and not as a pessimistic one?
It's a great question, Eric. Thank you. You always ask terrific questions. I see it as an optimistic story because the same reason that I wrote the book for the same reason I do the weekly podcast we do and other things, because I actually think young people can change this. I have no desire to talk to Marjorie Taylor Greene. No, if she wants to buy a book, that's fine. I have no desire to try to convince her. That's a total waste of time. I don't think we're going to have some kumbaya moment, as you said, but I do think young people are different. And I think the stakes are really large. And I think that's why people like Ron DeSantis and others are trying to prevent us from actually teaching this history to young people. What I've seen with my students, and again, these are students at the University of Texas, they're not necessarily representative of students everywhere. What I've seen with my kids is they care about these things. They are visualizing white supremacy. My son and my students, I think, have a better sense, especially after George Floyd and then what's happened in Memphis, of what white supremacy is than I did growing up in New York City as the child of immigrants. They have a better sense of what it is. There's an opening. There's been a sobering. There's been an unveiling. And I don't think that's going to last, but I think that's a possibility. And it's great that you brought up the civil rights movement. I do think we've had these openings in our history. The civil rights movement was one of them. And so I do think we're not going to solve all of this, but I do think this generation has an opportunity. And I think there is an opening there. And so really, who am I writing for? In a sense, I'm writing for my students. And they make me optimistic. They have other issues. But I think they're more attuned to these things. Look at how far they've come on sexuality. Look at how far they've come on a lot of these issues, it seems to me.
Thank you. And so a follow-up, if I may. I am wondering about the issue of, I guess I would call it racial reductionism. And so the through line has to do with multiracial democracy being challenged by white supremacy. I would imagine that conservatives today would say, we resent that connection, at least some of them might. maybe the conservative op-ed writers in the New York Times. And there are other elements at play. The new right push for deregulation, the anti-abortion politics, the problematization of gender and sexuality today, the fight against taxes. So there are connections to the Civil War era, but I think that a conservative would say, nope, this has to do with very different sets of issues. And the new authoritarianism that we see around us is not just a US-based issue. Hungary, Turkey, even Sweden, who did not go through the American Civil War, are also experiencing some of these same impulses. So I wonder, could you tell this story differently? And are there risks in posing this largely as a story of the struggle between multiracial democracy and white supremacy, with other factors subordinate to that?
Absolutely. Terrific points, Eric. You're right. There's never anything that's explained one way. I mean, it's the first thing that we as historians say to some of our other social science colleagues, right? There are no independent variables. There's no one way, one explanation. And so obviously, and this comes back to some of the points Michael made so well, the Reconstruction era is different from our era. And the differences certainly outweigh the similarities. And there are many different dynamics at work. And also, as historians, we're also attuned to contingency. Right? Think how different a few votes in a certain moment make, whether FBI Director Comey writes a letter at a particular moment or not. There's so many things that can change outcomes. So this book doesn't intend, I don't think any good historian tries to write a book that has the silver bullet, secret explanation of what has actually made all this. Those might sell books, but that's schlock, right? What I'm arguing is that this is a necessary but not sufficient way of understanding. I don't think you can understand what we are experiencing in the United States, which might have similarities to what's happening in Hungary or Brazil for other reasons. But you cannot explain the way this is inflected in the United States. And I have to say, Eric, on this point, for all the differences, and maybe it's just when you write a book, you see that everywhere. But every day it seems to be reinforced for me, because the racial overtones of the authoritarianism in the United States are so extraordinary. The governor of my state just today issued an order saying he didn't want anyone taking account of any diversity issues when making hiring at the university. No diversity. He doesn't want us to take account of any. What motivates him to say that in a state that's actually the most diverse state in the country, a state that's a majority minority state, a state that depends on this? Austin's the fastest growing city in the United States because of its diverse workforce, right? 300 people move to Austin every day, many of whom are not actually white-skinned people. So what's going on here? And so my point is, you can't understand this fully if you don't understand this dimension that we've talked about today, but this dimension does not explain it fully. It might not even explain it mostly, but it is part of what's going on.
Thank you.
Can I sneak in just really quickly to say that's kind of where I was going when I said, would we see some things just as clearly or even more clearly if we attended to the authoritarian streak in the 1860s, if we attended to gender? Because I think that those are there. Yes. I think connected and not separate. So that's kind of where I was going with those comments, that we can try and divide this out into a whole bunch of different issues, but actually they're more they're not the same, but they are interconnected. So the don't say gay is not entirely divorced from racial anxieties. That was kind of my point with the Wade Hampton days, and there's a lot of gender going on that's buttressing and working together and interweaving with the white supremacy. That's what I meant by all of that.
Totally, that's super helpful. I totally agree.
Thank you. We're going to go to our participant audience. There are a number of hands up. Forgive me on my pronunciation of names, but Dwayne Eugene has been patiently waiting. If you unmute yourself, you can pose the question directly. Go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it's Derek Eugene. And my question stems from the comment Professor Suri made about being an immigrant. And recently we had another immigrant on the national stage, Nikki Haley, speak to how basically deny that there's racism in America, I guess, based upon her immigrant experience. And I wonder how that fits into your narrative, Suri, what she hopes to accomplish by making that pronouncement, or if you think she actually believes that.
I don't know whether she believes that or not. It's a great question. My view is a very simple one, that you don't want to, sometimes you don't see what you don't want to see. And it's often empowering for members of my family can fall into this narrative themselves. It's it can feel empowering to say, I've not faced any constraints. I'm one of the mainstream. I'm part of this, and you can sometimes be rewarded for that. And so I don't mean to imply that when someone says something like that, because again, people in my own family would sometimes say things like that, that it makes the person a bad person. But I think it's sometimes seeing what you want to see and not seeing what you don't want to see. And it's our job as historians to peel back the world around us. The evidence of discrimination and inequality and outcomes in our society is overwhelming. It's undeniable. We can argue over why, how, and where. But it seems to me it's patently, honestly ridiculous to say that that doesn't exist in our society, or in any society for that matter.
Thank you. Also with their hand up, and again, apologies on my pronunciation, AJ Azareth, if you would unmute yourself, join the conversation. This happens periodically, the unmute problem. It doesn't seem to be working. So if you want to type your question in the chat, I can take a look at that. Our next person in the queue is Sumava Basu. Please unmute.
Hello, Professor Suri. This is Somava from India, and hi. So
Really?
I just wanted to ask you a question. Like in your book, you have mentioned about the failure of reconstruction is one of the feature that has been always a weakness of American democracy, and you take it as one of the features for the book which you have mentioned, the failures, the civil wars. So to what extent the foreign policy, in your views, is equally responsible? Like we have seen, you have also mentioned about the Capitol riots, but it is regarding the Trump administration. But when it comes to the Afghanistan policy of Biden, so what would be your views on that? Yes.
Thank you, Sumava, for your excellent question, for bringing foreign policy in. What I would say, there's a lot to answer to that, but I'll just make one point, not particularly about Afghanistan, but this would connect what we've talked about today and the work of Michael and Chandra and myself on this book with the work of historians who have been looking at the export of American racial thinking to other societies. And I think part of what we're seeing here is that the ways in which certain ways of thinking about race get embedded in American society at home, then that gets transferred overseas as well. So Mary Renda has written about this in Haiti, for example, Ada Ferrer in the case of Cuba, because the United States maps itself at home in part for many of the reasons that Michael and Chandra talked about, in a way that embeds continued racial segregation and subordination and violence at home. That becomes something then that when we're exporting democracy, we're exporting to other societies. And to connect to Chandra's point, and such is something I need to spend more time thinking about, I think also our proclivity for authoritarians overseas to some extent might be driven by the authoritarianism that Chandra is reminding us is built into this beyond race itself, right? And so the acceptance, the legitimization of this behavior at home often becomes a way of legitimizing it in our relationships overseas. And it's why I think I'm one of many historians of American foreign policy to say that actually our support for democratization overseas has been much thinner than our rhetoric. that the reality has looked more like Reconstruction or elements of it, and less like what makes the post-World War II Reconstruction, the role of the New Dealers that John Dower and Mel Leffel and others have written about after World War II, most significant is they don't fall into that. But they might be people who are more blissfully ignorant of this history than the ones responsible for a lot of other foreign policy elsewhere.
Thank you. We have some questions posted in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask one on behalf of Greg Lipscomb, who asks, have the arguments offered in support of white supremacy changed from 1870 to 2020? For example, have they become more economic, competition for jobs, or less genetic, dilution of the gene pool? And then I will tag onto that. If so, how and why has it changed?
I'll give a quick answer. I think Michael and Chandra will have things to say about this, probably better things to say about this. I think the arguments have changed, but I just want to point, because I'm on Mr. Continuity today, I'm gonna point to two things that stay the same. Certainly, there is the continued argument in white supremacist circles that people who don't look a certain way and don't have a certain background, that they are still somehow foreign. That kind of basic othering, that they're not the natural people who should be here. And I think that is a genetic argument. And then second, the continual denial of the historical legacies. So when we're debating these issues, the unwillingness to see how the historical legacies prevent others who have not been able to do something from having an opportunity, right? And that's already, of course, a story in 1860. It's that history matters, right? My argument would be that the white supremacist arguments are explicitly, flagrantly ahistorical, anti-historical, because history would point out the problems of a claim of equal opportunity that don't exist. And that's, I think, why we see today white supremacists, as in the past, not wanting to tell a particular history. So those would be two continuities I would point to. There are obviously differences.
Chandra or Michael, if you care to weigh in, feel free. Or not.
I would say that the mechanism, or I don't know if mechanism is right, the way it works, I think is pretty standard over time. It works by appealing to sense of fear and threat. That there is something fundamental, not just material, but fundamental, that is threatened. One's own personhood, one's sense of oneself as a man or a woman, the safety of one's family and children are threatened, and that I genuinely think is that's where the power of white supremacy comes from, and that's why it can supersede things like direct economic interest. That's why 2/3 of Confederate soldiers don't come from slaveholding families and fight anyway. That part, I think, remains pretty steady over time. I think what exactly feels and looks and is portrayed as most threatening at this moment, I think that does change in response to time, place, circumstances.
Yeah, and I would say the time, place, circumstance thing, the thing that sort of strikes me is that until lately, the modern Republican Party has mostly tried to avoid openly racist appeals. Whereas in 1860, 1864, 1868, they really make white supremacy, the calling card of their movement, that one of the two major parties is openly, aggressively racist out loud. And that has until lately not been the central theme.
Would I be wrong in suggesting that there's white supremacy and there's white supremacy, and it's a term that encompasses many different kind of gradients of racialist thinking, and whatever's on the mind of, I don't know, Nikki Haley in her opening ad or Tim Scott is quite different, profoundly different than perhaps the Richard Spencers or those marching in Charlottesville,
Right.
or the Delaware Confederate group that you begin the book talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. But it's still white supremacy, right? I mean, it's different kinds of it.
I would just say that if you show your students some of the democratic stuff from the campaign of 1864, some of their slogans, some of their posters, students even now are shocked.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I agree.
We have an anonymous attendee who poses a straightforward political question about our current moment. Is the country anywhere near as divided as we're continually told we are, and which we seem to unthinkingly accept and repeat that we are? And so I think the implication here is that we're not. How would you weigh in on that?
I agree with that proposition. I've made this argument a few times in writing, and I've had the opportunity a few times to make this argument to people who are broadcasters that they make us more divided than we are by making everything about one side versus the other. Just a couple of obvious things, right? 75% of Americans agree that 18-year-olds shouldn't be able to buy AR-15. 75% of Americans believe that women who are raped should not be forced to give birth. We can go on, right? So, there's a lot of actual agreement in our country. And I think our political institutions and our political process highlights differences. And it empowers, and I think this is the point that I'm trying to make in the book, among others, that it empowers small groups of people who strongly hold to a position to, in a sense, tyrannize our democracy. And that's why I made the point that the remedies that we think are supposed to work don't often work, because they hijack the process. Our democracy is being hijacked, or there's an effort at hijacking our democracy by an organized small minority. And that is exactly what I think is also happening in 1867, 68, 69.
Let me pose a last question from another anonymous attendee, and it gets us back to Reconstruction and the core of the book. This person had to step away a few times, but asks, has anyone talked about the extent to which so-called radical Republicans were complicit in blocking democracy's advance? So if you could just reflect on the program of the radical Republicans and what happened to it.
So I mean, my view, I think Michael and Chandra, in particular, Michael, are going to have maybe different and more detailed perspectives on this. My view, having looked very closely at this for this period, is that the radical Republicans were not the problem. It was some of the people I mentioned before, and I mentioned in the book: Senator Lyman Trumbull, Senator Fessenden from Maine, John Sherman, who were, I don't know what we want to call them. They didn't think of themselves as radical Republicans, right? They thought of themselves more as mainstream Republicans, James Garfield himself. And they were concerned, for example, that someone like Benjamin Wade, who was seen as a radical Republican from Ohio and was pro tem of the Senate, that he would become president, for example, if Johnson was convicted, and that he would go too far. It was these, I want to call them in a slightly more contemporary terms, moderate Republicans, these figures who did not want to continue funding the Justice Department, who believed the military shouldn't be used in a heavy-handed way in the South. I think they were the problem. That's probably not even fair to say they were the problem. They were one of the limitations on what Grant and other Republican leaders could do. There's no doubt that in the trial of Andrew Johnson, it is the radical Republicans who want Andrew Johnson out, and it is the less radical Republicans who don't vote for, who actually switch their votes in addition to those who were bribed. But I want to defer to Michael, because this is a point you were talking about much more before. So I want to defer to your thoughts on this.
Well, I guess what I'd say here is that coming out of the Civil War, there is this wave of Northern patriotism that kind of made anti-slavery and Black military service part of the Republican package of a stronger national government, turn its back on things like states' rights secessionism, and that kind of was willing to go to the length of promoting Black suffrage as part of this package agenda of securing the results of the war. But I suspect that this generational mood is not going to last forever, and that most of the Northern public, as new issues emerged, like the economy, are going to back off of these commitments over time. And so I sort of think that we're looking at is a generation that has a strong egalitarian bent that is probably not going to last forever.
Hmm.
And in addition, Grant is trying the Ku Klux Act is also quite a departure from traditional standards of states' rights.
Right.
A lot of what the federal government is doing is seen as moving the needle quite a ways from what America historically had been, and people are probably going to move back as the passions of the war cool. Did that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. No, that
Indeed. Unfortunately, I have to draw this session to a close. I think we could go on for quite some time, but alas, we can't. So I want to thank Jeremi, Chandra, and Michael for this discussion. I thank those posing questions, and apologies to those whose questions I couldn't get to. And I'd like to invite you all back on Monday, February 27th, just a number of days from now, for the next session of the Washington History Seminar that will explore Carolyn Eisenberg's just published Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia. Till then, stay safe, good night, and thank you.